Welcome back to the bench. My name is Paul and this is the second video in my series building Revell's 1:72 scale Nashorn. Today I'm going to paint and weather it, taking you step by step to show how I achieved a worn winter camouflage. I started this paint job how I start most of my paint jobs. I got a matte black acrylic and gave the entire model a coat. This unifies all of our surfaces such as our upgraded styrene side armour and our metal grab handles, and makes the model much easier to read. I opt to use black instead of grey because this ensures that any places I miss later on with paints will read as shadows in the end. I'm using an airbrush here, but only because I'm too lazy to use a spray can outside. Those work just as well and sometimes even better for total coverage. Next up, I grabbed AK's chocolate brown chipping colour and I gave the model a zenithal coat, meaning I focused most of my paint on the upper surfaces and left more shadowed areas black. This step warms up our base coat, which will improve our dunkelgelb vibrancy coming up. My goal is not complete coverage here. The main colours on this tank will come later, so we just want to add some variation to our base coat here and set ourselves up for some chipping effects. I wanted to depict a Nashorn on the eastern front, so adding some dark brown chips under our dunkelgelb and white will help to depict a war-weary and visually interesting vehicle. I sprayed AK's worn effects in 2 thin coats as suggested on the bottle, before mixing an approximate German yellow colour and spraying it over the top. Pretty straightforward stuff so far. Using a stiff old paintbrush and a bamboo kebab skewer, I dampened areas of the paintwork to reactivate the chipping medium and scratched away the yellow to reveal dark brown paint underneath. I focused on the edges of panels, storage boxes and hatches to begin, which are likely to see scuffing and scraping with constant use in the field. The scratches with the skewer were then reinforced using the stiff brush, which gives less control but more of an overall wear effect. This is an easy step to get carried away with, and I'll be the first to admit that my chipping here is overboard, but knowing that I have layers of whitewash to come later, I don't mind overdoing it because I know most of it will be covered over and I can just choose to hide especially offending areas with white. I was very pleased with the textured surface on the floor and the fenders of the kit at this stage, make for the perfect canvas for this step, and creating worn and scuffed areas where the crew were constantly walking and moving around was very satisfying. The back doors were another particular surface I focused on. These are often seen wide open in reference pictures during operation, so I have no qualms about damaging the edges, corners and hinges of these areas that see constant foot traffic, ammunition loading and unloading, and bits of kit being scraped against them. The Nashorn had famously small ammunition storage and relied on resupply from support vehicles during operation, so it's not hard to imagine careless and hurried movement and resupply through these back doors. The gun saw some wear for the same reason. This was my first time using dedicated medium instead of regular hairspray, and I was pretty happy with my results. The AK product certainly seemed easier to control. The hairspray can feel inconsistent in how it reacts to the paintbrush agitation in a way that the worn effects fluid doesn't. Certainly an upgrade, but I'll also say not a required one. Hairspray can totally do the same thing with some extra care. And it smells nice. Although the instructions note them as being from a Nashorn in Alsace, I decided to use the red identification markings to add some colour and interest to my winter camo. These decals were really nice. They were super thin and I don't think I even needed the micro set and saw I used to make sure they conformed. The rest of the markings were applied accordingly to their locations on the instructions, and although I at first applied the red heart on a white background from the Alsace example I mentioned before, I decided to remove it to take a half step towards more generic markings. Next up, I mixed up some more of my base coat, about a 2-to-1 mix of Army Painter's Desert Yellow and Banshee Brown, and used it to clean up some of my more excessive chipping from earlier. By carefully dotting it over parts of the decals, we can better integrate them into our model and simulate areas where they may have been chipped or damaged themselves. To add some depth to our paintwork, I used an enamel pin wash which settles into the recesses and makes some of the moulded details pop. I took extra care in the textured fighting compartment floor I mentioned earlier. I want to accentuate the detail without flooding the whole area and darkening it. This would undo the work we did earlier, creating contrast between the chipping and the paintwork, so I'm mostly focused on seams and corners here. I love how this step makes rivets, panel lines and hinges clear and visible. Most people will only ever engage with or see this model from half a meter away or more, so the pin wash ensures that even the smallest details remain legible at that distance. If it looks too strong or bleeds out more than I would like, I can always come back with a little white spirit to remove the excess, so I don't have to worry about ruining any of my work so far either. With the bulk of the interior complete, I scraped the paint off the connection points and glued the gun in place. It seems obvious, but since the glue melts the plastic parts together, scraping off paint from any sub-assemblies is essential to ensure a good bond. Then came the most tedious step so far. You're now watching, at 20 times speed, me painting the rubber tiles around 48 individual road wheels. These were painted in a cool grey, and then a warm grey was used to paint the tracks, which helps to differentiate the two materials of rubber and steel on this lower hull. This is where our dark base coats come in handy. Anywhere I can't quite reach with the dark grey will remain as shadow and in black, where it won't be noticeable or stick out as different. This was especially the case between the top of the top track and the bottom of the upper hull. I almost forgot the spare track on the front at this stage, but thankfully I caught it just before my grey paint dried out. Once they had dried, I used a dry rust acrylic effect paint all over my tracks to add some variety and some wear. This paint looks super vibrant on the palette when it first applied, but it settles around the details and soon dries into a believable and easy rust effect. Blacks and browns were used to pick out other relevant details across the model, such as periscopes, vision ports, gunner seats and the jack block. I always used to think that this was an actual wooden box, but recently I found out it's just a solid chunk of wood to disperse the weight of the jack while doing repairs on uneven or soft ground. I used a silver metallic paint to add sheen to the two MP40s stored in the fighting compartment, as well as the breech of the gun. Then a brighter silver was used along the raised parts of each track where the metal has been polished by roads and stones. This is an easy step which immediately makes your tracks look like real heavy metal, not to mention it's super relaxing, satisfying and quick. The teeth on the tracks and the edges of the metal wheels were given a similar treatment from where they would have rubbed off one another. Now, just using the sand colour from my Dunkelgelb mix from earlier, I went around the model and picked out all the tiny details. I applied it quite thin along edges and details, like rivets, to help them stand out from the chipping and the pin wash we did earlier. Again, this helps with legibility on such a small model. When applied around the edges of our chipping, it also enhances the effect to create the look of worn paint. And with that, the model was ready for our worn winter camo. If you're enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It would be super cool to get to 100 subscribers by the end of this project. I'd super appreciate if you could send this to a friend who might enjoy it. With another coat of chipping fluid applied, I think it's time to show the reference picture that inspired this build, and the super unique winter camo I'll be imitating. Squiggly lines for days. I first added white to the airbrush and tried to spray these lines. It worked okay, but even super close to the model, the lines were pretty thick at this scale and I was struggling a bit with the paint drying out on the tip of my airbrush. I tried a few times to get into a good flow doing these lines, but I wasn't feeling it, so instead I added a quick white gradient at the bottom of the armour panels and pulled out a small brush. I used the pre-thinned paint from the airbrush cup and began to replicate some of the squiggles from the reference picture. I painted what I could see first, mostly the front and right armour plate, in order to get a better understanding of the pattern and the shapes. They're quite wavy, in places you just get a big circular blob, which almost makes me think something long like a floor mop was used to create this field applied camo. The main thing I took from this image when moving on to my own pattern was that neatness was clearly not a concern. I found myself letting the brush lead most of the way, and I added random areas of proper coverage amongst the curvy lines in accordance with what I could see from the reference. With most of the pattern in, I returned to the airbrush, feeling less pressured this time, to add some extra randomness and variation across the surface, breaking up some of the hard lines that the paintbrush made. To further break up the whitewash, I once again got a stiff old brush dampened with water and I stippled away some of the chipping fluid to add another layer of texture and wear. This let me reveal some of the markings that were slightly covered by our last layer of white, as well as the areas of constant use that I outlined earlier in the video. Finally, for the whitewash, I used some pure white to add some subtle and limited streaking to some of the squiggles, and generally refined areas of chipping, adding more white in the areas I removed too much from. A mix of dark brown and red brown speed paint was applied to the exhausts as well as the towing hooks in order to create a super quick rust effect on these areas that will be likely to see it. I did this at this stage rather than earlier with the rest of the chipping because I wanted to make sure that they were not covered with the layer of whitewash. Rinse and repeat step from earlier, but this time with black enamel paint wash instead of brown. I started this effect around the cooling vents where I imagined plenty of grime might seep out from the engine itself before turning to the rest of the details and definition which were just lost during the whitewashing step. This was a much more refined pin wash than the one earlier. Only the most important details needed picked out, such as the hatches and some of the panel lines and seams. Dark earth effects were added to the lower hull to simulate accumulated winter mud. This is an acrylic paste, so it's easily blended out with water, which allows for more built-up deposits around the corners and transmission parts, and less build-up on more smoother, easier to reach areas. This was followed by a snow sprinkles texture effect, this time around corners and flat exposed areas where snow would logically gather. This effect dries clearer than it goes on, which is a shame because I love the contrast of the slight bluey tone of this effect when it's wet against our warm coloured Nashorn. I tried to be quite refined inside the crew compartment. This is likely to see a lot more use and would likely have a lot more chance of melting considering its proximity to both the crew and the engine. Still, I applied some in the corners and some on top of the storage bins where I felt it would probably end up. The end was now in sight, so I put out a small amount of black oil paint and dry blended it around the end of the gun to suggest a weapon that's seen some use. This effect was then toned down with some white spirits. With the oils out, I added some brown to the mix and I applied it in a streaking fashion around the lower hull where wet mud would likely accumulate. Paired with some extremely subtle streaking and speckling on the upper hull, we had done most of the weathering that this tank needed. While I'm speckling away, I thought I'd let you know that I'm going to be painting some crew for this tank next, so make sure you stick around for the next video so you don't miss me struggling with some tiny 1/72 scale figures. Almost ready to call it done, I still felt as though I could push the contrast one step further, so I added a final thicker pass with the oils to really drive the winter mud effects home. And so after some MIG wet effects in the appropriate areas and around our slushy snow, I set it aside and I called it done. If you made it this far, I would like to thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. 1/72 scale is a super interesting scale to work with, where I find you have to strike a balance between realism and legibility. That said, it's also a popular scale for beginners, so if that's one of you watching this, then I hope you found something in this video that you can use in your own projects. Regardless, I appreciate your support on the channel over the last month, and I'll see you for some figure painting next time.